The saloon roared with whiskey and smoke. Laughter bounced off the walls as cards hit the tables, and Boots stomped to a fiddle that was more guts than tune. But then the door creaked open, and she stepped inside. The noise didn't just stop, it changed. It twisted into something sharp, something predatory. Every single eye in that room locked onto the stranger in the plain dress. Her shawl pulled so tight across her shoulders, it was a wonder she could breathe. She froze in the doorway, trembling, clutching that faded fabric like it was armor. She took a step, her shoes making a soft, scared sound on the boards. "Please," she whispered, her voice a ghost in the den of wolves. "I need work. Any work. I can scrub floors, I can wash dishes, anything." A boom of laughter cut her off, hot and cruel. A man at the table closest to her leaned back, his eyes glinting under the lantern light, a grin splitting his face. "Work?" he jeered, his voice dripping with scorn. "This ain't a charity, but a girl like you. You could warm a man's lap." His hand shot out like a snake. He snagged the edge of her shawl, yanking her toward him as the whole room erupted in howls and hoots. She gasped, stumbling, trying to pull back as tears flooded her eyes. "Don't touch me!" she cried, her voice shattering in the smoke-filled air. It was a sound of pure desperation, pure fear. The laughter just got louder. Boots pounded the floorboards. Mugs were raised high in a toast to her humiliation. And then, a different sound, the heavy thud of boots crossing the floor. From a dark corner, the rancher had risen. His broad shoulders carved a path through the haze as he strode forward, his hat tipped back, his eyes burning with a dark fire. The man still had his hand on her shawl, smirking, but that smirk started to die when the rancher's shadow fell over them both. Without a word, the rancher reached down. He gripped the drunk's wrist with a strength that was pure iron, forcing it down, breaking his grip on her shawl. His voice was low, but it cut through the room like a gunshot. "Stand behind me." The saloon went dead silent. Every head turned. The laughter died so fast it was like it had never been there at all. She just stared up at him, her breath caught in her throat, tears trembling on her lashes. The warmth of his back was a wall, a shield blocking out the jeers, blocking out the hungry eyes of the crowd. Murmurs started to ripple through the room, a mix of disbelief and mockery. "The rancher's shielding trash?" Someone scoffed from the bar. "He's gone soft." But others whispered something different, their eyes darting from her torn shawl to the man who stood tall and unshaken, a mountain in the middle of a storm. The drunk snarled and jerked his hand free, but the rancher didn't even flinch. He just shifted his stance, planting himself squarely in front of her, his gaze sweeping over the silent crowd. "She asked for work," he said, his voice steady as stone. "You'll give her respect." The silence that followed was so sharp you could cut yourself on it. The fiddler in the corner let his bow fall with a clatter. The only sound left was the ragged hiss of her own breathing. She clutched the shawl tighter, her shame and fear now tangled with something new. An anchor, a shield, a promise that echoed in the smoky air. "Stand behind me." For the first time since she'd walked into the dust-choked streets of Dustin, she wasn't completely alone. But she could still feel their eyes burning into her. The ridicule not gone, just waiting. Waiting for the moment his back was turned so the jeers could rise all over again. And standing in the shadow of his strength, she had to wonder, could one man's vow really stand against a whole town's laughter? The silence in the saloon lasted for a single heartbeat, and then it shattered. Laughter came roaring back like a flash flood through a broken dam. "Respect?" one man barked, his voice thick with whiskey. "She don't look like she's worth a button, let alone respect." Another man slapped the bar, his grin wide and cruel. "Red Fern's gone mad, fighting off dogs for a scrap." The words washed over her, sharp and mocking. The men who had been sitting idle just moments before were all leaning forward now, hungry for the show. She clutched her shawl, her face burning hot as their eyes crawled all over her, their sneers digging into her deeper than any fingers ever could. But the rancher didn't move. His stance was broad, steady, his body still a shield between her and the crowd. He didn't say a word, but the weight of his silence pressed down on them harder than their jeers ever could. Slowly, their laughter started to falter. But then a man named Vernon Hale stood up from his chair in the back. He had a cruel jaw and a thirst for trouble. His voice dripped with venom. "Stand behind you, eh?" he drawled, and his gaze slid over her like the edge of a blade. "You think a plain girl with nothing but rags deserves the hand of a rancher? You shame yourself, Red Fern. You shame this whole town." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room, though some of the men hung back, suddenly uncertain. She shrank under the force of his glare, her shawl clenched so tight the threads were biting into her skin. "I only asked for work," she whispered, her voice trembling. Hale laughed, a sharp, cruel sound. "Work? Dustin doesn't need beggars. We need women who can give a man more than just dishwater and tears." The saloon erupted in cruel laughter again. Boots stomped, mugs clattered, and she felt her knees start to buckle, her strength just draining away. But then the rancher's hand found her arm, steadying her. It was firm and warm, and when he spoke, his voice was pure iron. "She asked for work, not your hands, not your scorn. If that shames you, it says a whole lot more about you than it does about her." Gas stirred in the room. Some men actually nodded in spite of themselves. Others just scowled deeper. Hale's eyes narrowed, fury sparking in them at being challenged in front of so many people. "You'll regret standing for her," he spat, his lip curling in a sneer. "This saloon eats the weak, and she's the weakest thing I've ever seen." He moved like a snake, his hand lashing out, snatching for the shawl that covered her chest. But this time, the rancher was ready. He caught Hale's wrist in mid-swing, twisting it so hard that Hale hissed in pain and staggered back. The crowd roared, some in shock, some in delight at seeing this clash of pride and strength. "Touch her again," the rancher said, his voice as deep as thunder, "and you'll answer to me." The threat hung in the smoky air, sharp and deadly. For a long moment, nobody dared to move. Hale yanked his hand free, cradling his wrist, his face dark with humiliation. But he didn't strike again. Instead, he just sneered, spitting on the floorboards. "Let's see how long you can guard a ghost," he snarled, and then he melted back into the crowd. She was trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart pounding like a drum against her ribs. But the rancher didn't falter. He guided her gently toward a chair at the edge of the room, his hand firm but careful, as if he thought she might break. The saloon was buzzing now, but the whispers were different. There was still mockery, still doubt, but there was something else, too. Something she'd never heard before. It was a trace of respect. She clutched her shawl tighter, knowing that the battle had only just begun. And every single thread of that shawl was now bound to him just as much as it was to her. The rancher settled her into a chair near the hearth, where the firelight flickered across the threads of her shawl, making every single fray and tear gleam like a scar. She pulled it closer, trying to hide in its folds, but the laughter still echoed in her ears. The whispers still felt like daggers in her heart. Across the room, Vernon Hale was nursing his wrist with a mug of whiskey, his eyes like hot coals, never leaving her. The rancher stood nearby, his arms crossed, silent but unmovable. His shadow was a wall between her and the poison that filled the room. For the first time since she'd set foot in Dustin, she could actually breathe, but every breath still tasted of smoke and fear. She leaned in and whispered so low that only he could hear. "That shawl was my mother's. It's all I have left of her. When he grabbed it, I thought I'd lose the last piece of her, too." Her voice cracked, and she bowed her head, but the rancher crouched down beside her. His gaze was steady, his words simple. "Then I will not let it be torn again." She blinked, startled by the certainty in his voice. Her fingers tightened on the fabric, as if his vow had somehow stitched new strength right into the seams. The fire snapped, sending a shower of sparks drifting up toward the rafters, like tiny fleeting stars. But before the silence could truly settle, a fresh wave of laughter broke out from the bar. "Look at her!" a man jeered, his voice carrying across the room. "Clinging to those rags like they're worth gold. Ain't no woman worth less than one who hides behind scraps." The saloon erupted again, the cruel voices rising, drowning out the fiddle, each man feeding off the scorn of the others. Her cheeks flamed hot, her heart felt like it was crumpling inside her chest, and she pressed the shawl tighter against her, as if their words could physically pierce her flesh. The rancher rose to his feet, his broad frame towering as he stepped out onto the open floor. His voice cut through the noise like a blade. What she holds is more than cloth. It is memory. It is dignity. And you soil yourselves by mocking it. The room stilled again, shocked by the sheer weight of his defiance. But you could still hear mutters bubbling up at the edges, from men who weren't willing to give up their cruelty so easily. Hale barked a bitter laugh. His pride was still stinging, and he pushed himself to his feet. "You talk like she's the Queen of Dustin, Red Fern," he sneered. "But all I see is a beggar dressed in pity. That shawl won't keep her from the truth." He started stalking closer, and the crowd pressed back to clear a space, eager for the show. Her breath caught in her throat, her fingers twisting in the fabric, but she forced herself to rise, trembling, her voice breaking free. "It is truth," she whispered, but it was loud enough to carry. "Truth that I have nothing else. And still, I stand." The words faltered, but they echoed in the sudden silence, silencing more than one sneer. For the first time, the crowd was looking at her, not as a shadow, but as something solid. Fragile, yes, but unbroken. Hale's sneer deepened, his fury mounting at her defiance. "Stand all you will," he spat, "but when that rag is torn from you, you'll see just how little you are." His threat hung heavy in the air. Murmurs rose like distant thunder. She sank back into her chair, her strength completely gone. But the rancher placed his hand on her shoulder, steady and firm. "It will not be torn," he said, his eyes locked on Hale. "Not while I draw breath." And even though the laughter rose again, brittle and cruel, his vow hung in the air, heavier still. It seemed to weave through the smoky rafters until the very timbers of the saloon carried its weight. She clutched the shawl, her heart trembling, and she knew that every thread of it now carried his promise as well as hers. The night got thicker with whiskey and malice. The saloon's lamps cast long, dancing shadows across the warped floorboards as the crowd pressed in tighter, just waiting for the next spark to catch fire. Hale was leaning against the bar, his jaw set, his pride gnawed raw by the rancher's words. The men around him were egging him on, their voices sharp with mockery. "Redfern's gone soft," one of them laughed, slamming his mug down on the bar. "Protecting rags and beggars like she's actually worth something." Another one spat on the floor. "I say we strip the shawl off her and see what she's hiding under there." Their jeers sent a ripple of brittle, eager laughter through the room. Her stomach twisted, as if each sound was clawing at her skin. She pulled the shawl tighter, wishing she could just vanish into its frayed folds. The rancher stood beside her, his broad shoulders squared, his silence heavier than any shout. His hand brushed against hers, a quiet anchor in the storm, and when she looked up at him, his gaze was steady, unshaken. Finally, Hale pushed himself off the bar. He strode forward, his boots thudding hard on the floorboards, each step ringing like a challenge. "You think standing between her and us makes her more than she is?" he sneered, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Dustin doesn't bow to beggars, and Dustin doesn't bow to Lakota lovers who shame their own kind." Gasps rippled through the crowd, sharp and ugly. It was a poisoned dart, meant to cut deeper than any insult about her. The rancher's jaw tightened, but when he spoke, his voice was low and steady as iron. "Respect does not bow. It stands." Hale laughed, a cruel, sharp sound. He started circling them, as though the saloon was a fighting ring built just for him. "Respect?" he barked. "Then let her stand on her own. Strip away the rag she clings to, and you'll see just how little is left." His hand shot forward, fast and vicious, grasping for the shawl, but she jerked back with a cry, stumbling against the table. "Don't touch me!" The words rang out, trembling but fierce. For an instant, the entire saloon froze, the echo of her voice cutting through the smoke and the sneers. The rancher stepped forward, his voice like thunder rolling low across the plains. "You heard her." He stood between them once more, his chest broad, his fists ready, the sheer weight of his frame blotting out Hale's smirk. Hale's lips curled, his pride inflamed. "Hide behind him if you want," he spat, "but sooner or later he won't be here. And when he's gone, you'll be nothing but rags again." The crowd murmured, some with cruel delight, others in an uneasy silence. Their faces were lit by the flickering lamplight, their eyes hungry for a clash. She trembled, clutching the shawl, her breath shallow. But when she looked at the rancher's back, so strong and immovable, a tiny spark of steadiness flickered in her chest. He turned his head just enough for her to hear, his words for her alone. "Hold tight. You're not alone." Then his gaze swung back to Hale, his stance rooted firm, his eyes dark with a promise. The air between them thickened. The room held its breath. Somewhere a mug shattered, the sound like a gunshot, and the saloon erupted in jeers once more, demanding a spectacle, demanding her shame. Hale spread his arms wide, mocking them. "Let's see if your vow holds when that shawl is lying in the dirt." His words hung in the air, heavy and full of menace, and she knew deep in her bones that the moment of tearing was coming. The shawl quivered in her hands as fragile as thread, but her heart clung to the vow that was wrapped tight in its folds. The vow that he would not let it fall without standing right there beside her. The saloon was a cauldron, ready to boil over. Every laugh was as sharp as broken glass, every whisper cut deep. Hale's pride had swollen past all restraint, and he strode forward with the swagger of a man who was certain the crowd would cheer for his cruelty. She backed up against the table, her shawl clutched so close it felt like it was stitched to her skin, her breath coming in ragged gasps as Hale's shadow fell across her. "Let's show Dustin what pity hides," he sneered, and his hand lashed out. She jerked away, her voice breaking in a cry. "Don't touch me!" But this time he was too quick. His fingers caught the shawl, yanking hard. The fabric ripped. It was a sound that silenced even the drunkest laughter. A harsh, tearing sound that echoed through the smoky air like a gunshot. Gasps broke the silence. The saloon erupted, a mix of shock and mockery. Men stamped their boots. Women covered their mouths with fake pity. The shawl dangled from Hale's fist, its frayed threads fluttering like a flag of victory. He held it high, his grin triumphant. "See?" he shouted, his voice ringing out. "A rag, nothing more. This is what Red Fern fights for. A beggar's scrap." She stood frozen, her arms bare, her cheeks flaming hot. The shame was a physical weight, threatening to crush her right where she stood. Every eye in that room was drinking in her humiliation. Her vision blurred with tears as the crowd's laughter rose like a storm, and for a moment she wished the floorboards would just split open and swallow her whole. Then a loud thud cracked through the noise, sharp and sudden. The rancher had slammed his fist down on the bar. The mugs rattled and the laughter faltered. He stepped forward, his stride unhurried, his face carved from stone. The very air seemed to bend around him, as if even the smoke didn't dare to touch him. Without a word, he closed the distance between them, his eyes locked on Hale, who for the first time seemed to falter, as the rancher's shadow swallowed his grin. "You tear cloth," the rancher said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the room, "because you cannot tear truth." He snatched the shawl from Hale's grip with such force that the man staggered back, his smirk broken, his wrist stinging from the strength of that hand. The crowd hushed, waiting. The rancher turned, the shawl hanging ragged in his grasp. He knelt down in front of her, his voice softer now, its heat steady against the storm. "It is torn," he said, placing it gently back into her trembling hands. "But so are we all. It still warms, and it still belongs to you." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she clutched the shredded fabric, her shame now tempered by the sheer weight of his vow. Gasps rippled through the crowd, whispers colliding in the smoky air. Some sneered, mocking his tenderness, while others just stared in an uneasy awe, as if they were seeing a kind of strength they had never understood before. Hale's face darkened, fury replacing his fleeting triumph. "This ain't over," he snarled, his voice cracking. "You'll bleed for shaming me in front of them all." He stormed back through the crowd, his men trailing behind him like dogs behind their master. The saloon roared again, but it wasn't with laughter this time. It was with the buzz of fear, of wonder, of a town torn between cruelty and respect. She clutched the shawl, its threads broken but its warmth intact. And though her body trembled, her heart felt the first flicker of something fierce. It was dignity, rising from the tatters. But she knew Hale's threat was still hanging heavy in the rafters. And the next time he struck, it wouldn't be cloth he was aiming to tear. It would be the very life she now dared to reclaim. After Hale stormed out, the noise in the saloon slowly bled away. The fiddle was silent, mugs were abandoned mid-raise, and the smoke hung thick with unease. She sat at the edge of the hearth again, the torn shawl clutched in her lap, its frayed edges a constant whisper of the humiliation she couldn't shake. Every eye in the room still lingered on her, some sharp with mockery, others restless with the memory of what had just been torn. Her cheeks burned, her chest rose and fell as if she had run for miles. And still, she couldn't bring herself to leave. Not when her legs refused to move. Not when the world outside promised nothing but more jeers. The rancher stood before her, his hands braced on the back of a chair. His gaze was fixed on the door through which Hale had vanished. His jaw was tight, his shoulders rigid, a storm brewing just beneath his silence. At last he turned, his voice low but steady, cutting through the thick air. "He will come again." She flinched at the certainty in his words. Her fingers twisted in the shawl until the threads dug into her skin. "I can't bear it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Every time they rip at it, I feel like I am nothing all over again." The rancher crouched beside her, his eyes level with hers, the firelight catching the steel in his gaze. "You are not nothing," he said, each word deliberate, heavy. "They laugh because they fear what they cannot break. The shawl is cloth. You are more." Her tears spilled over, falling hot onto the torn fabric. "It was my mother's. The last piece of her I had, and now it's ruined." He reached out, his hand brushing against the frayed edge with a gentleness that startled her. "Ruined?" he asked softly. "No. Torn, yes. But torn is not the same as broken. It still carries her warmth. And now, it carries mine too." His words wrapped around her like the shawl once had, and for a heartbeat she let herself believe him. But the whispers rose again from the crowd, cruel voices that refused to die. "She'll drag him down with her pity," one man muttered. "Red Fern's throwing his name in the mud," another one scoffed. The rancher rose to his full height, his shadow falling across them all, his voice ringing through the rafters. "Let them speak, I will not bend." His declaration split the room. Some men shifted in their seats, a flicker of shame in their eyes. Others just sneered deeper, unwilling to give up their spite. She stared up at him, her breath caught in her chest, the torn shawl pressed close, as if his words had somehow stitched strength back into his phrase. For the first time, she felt the crowd's noise begin to dim in her heart, drowned out by the weight of his vow. Outside, you could hear the crunch of boots on snow as Hale's men lingered, their laughter carrying through the cold night air, promises of vengeance woven into every sound. She trembled, fear gnawing at her chest, but the rancher's hand found hers, firm and unyielding. "They will try again," he said, his voice like iron. "And when they do, I will stand before you as many times as it takes." She clutched his hand, the shawl pressed between their palms. And though her tears still fell, they no longer tasted of shame. They tasted of something new. Resolve. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the air. And for the first time since the tearing, she felt not ruined, but remade. But she knew the storm wasn't over. Hale's pride had been split wide open in front of the whole saloon. And men like him don't lick their wounds in silence. When he returned, he wouldn't be coming for cloth. He would be coming for blood. The days that followed were heavy, each hour weighted with whispers. The story spread through the streets of Dustin like a wildfire. How the rancher had stood up to the whole saloon. How Vernon Hale's pride had been ripped as raw as the shawl he tore. Some people laughed, calling it a fool's errand. Others murmured that, maybe, just maybe, the rancher's strength had shown them a kind of truth they'd all forgotten. But wherever she walked, eyes followed her, mocking, curious, but never kind. She kept the torn shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Each fray was a reminder of her shame, but also of the vow that was now stitched into its tatters by the man who had given it back to her. The rancher stayed close, quiet and watchful. His hand was always near hers, his gaze constantly scanning every corner, as if he expected danger to spill out from the shadows at any moment. That danger came sooner than either of them had hoped. On the third night, the saloon lamps were glowing like embers across the street, the sound of laughter spilling out into the snow-hushed darkness. She was lingering by the window of the cabin, clutching the shawl, when the sound of heavy boots struck the porch. The door rattled under a pounding fist, and a voice snarled through the wood. "Red Fern! You think you shamed me? You think Dustin is going to bow to your pity? Come out and face me like a man!" It was Hale. His words were thick with rage, his wounded pride dragging half a dozen men along with him. Their laughter was hard and cruel, their torches casting flickering, monstrous shadows. The rancher set down his cup. His face was calm, but his eyes were dark, a storm gathering. He rose, crossed the room in 3 long strides, and opened the door to the cold. There stood Hale, his hat pulled low, his eyes burning with hate. His men were fanned out behind him, their jeers a chorus of pure spite. "Bring her out!" Hale spat, pointing toward the woman who was clutching her shawl in the shadows. "Let the town see what kind of trash you're hiding. Or are you afraid they'll find out she ain't worth your name?" She trembled, pressing the shawl tighter, her heart hammering against her ribs like a drum. The rancher stepped out onto the porch, his frame filling the doorway, his voice steady. "She's not yours to touch, Hale. She never was." Hale's grin curled like a knife. "Not mine. Not anyone's. That's the truth of her, isn't it? Unwanted. You can't change that by playing her guard dog." The rancher's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. "She is wanted. She is chosen. And you'll choke on that truth before I let you lay a hand on her again." The men behind Hale roared with laughter. One of them spat into the snow. "Big word," one of them mocked. "Let's see if he bleeds as proud as he speaks." The rancher stepped forward, his boots crunching on the frost, his voice low enough to cut right through their jeers. "Try!" The word hung in the night air like a drawn pistol. Hale's grin faltered, but his pride shoved him onward. He lunged, his fist swinging wild. But the rancher caught him hard, shoving him back into the snow. Gasps broke from the crowd, their laughter torn into shards. She stood frozen in the doorway, the shawl clutched to her chest, her breath ragged. The firelight from the cabin spilled out across the snow, catching the torn fabric of her shawl and the pure rage in Hale's eyes. He scrambled to his feet, spitting blood, his voice a snarl. "This ends in the square. Before all of Dustin, I'll tear your vow apart where everyone can see." He turned and his men dragged him away, their torches bobbing and weaving into the night. The rancher watched them vanish, his chest rising and falling, steady. But when he turned back to her, his eyes carried the truth. The storm was coming. And this time, the whole town would be the witness. By dawn, the entire town of Dustin was buzzing with the news of Hale's challenge. The gossip was spilling out of every doorway and hitching posts like smoke from a wildfire. The talk from the saloon had spread to the mercantile, the blacksmith's forge, even the churchyard. Red Fern had defied Vernon Hale, and now the town square would be the place that decided who held the truth. She heard it all from the shadows of the cabin, the torn shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, every whisper a fresh cut. "He's ruined," one woman hissed as she passed by. "No man stands against Hale and lives." Another voice muttered, "He's a fool throwing his name away on her." The words stung, but the rancher just moved about his chores as steady as ever, his silence like stone. Only when the sky began to blush with the colors of dusk did he step inside, wiping the frost from his beard, his eyes finding hers where she sat by the fire. "It will be tonight," he said simply. Her breath caught, her fingers tightening on the shawl. "What? What will he do?" He crouched down, his gaze level with hers, his hand resting over hers on the worn fabric. "What he always does. Try to break what he can't understand." His voice softened. "But you will not break." She shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "I already have. They all saw it." His thumb brushed against the frayed threads of the shawl. "They saw cloth torn. They did not see you fall. Tonight. They will." The words sank deep into her, steadying her breath, even as fear coiled tight in her chest. When the square filled, lanterns were swinging from every post, their glow casting long shadows over the crowd that swarmed in like a tide. Families pressed close together. Children were lifted onto their fathers' shoulders. Men leaned against wagons, their voices thick with anticipation. Hale was standing near the fountain, his broad frame cutting a dark figure against the light. His grin was wide as he cracked his knuckles, his pride swelling in his chest. The rancher entered from the far side, his stride even, his hat tipped low, his gaze steady. Murmurs swept through the crowd. Some people were jeering, others were whispering doubt. A few were just quiet, curious. She followed behind him, her shawl pulled tight across her arms, every step shaking but sure. Her heart was pounding against her ribs, so hard she thought it might burst. The crowd gasped, their voices sharp. "She dares to come," one man spat. "Shame doesn't burn her enough." Hale's grin widened, his voice booming over the lantern-lit square. "There she is, the beggar queen herself, clinging to rags and pity. Dustin, shall we watch her crumble?" Laughter thundered through the square. Boots stomped, mugs were lifted high. She faltered, trembling under the weight of so many eyes. But the rancher's hand found hers, firm and unshaken. He stepped forward, his voice ringing out, loud and clear. "You call her unwanted. I call her chosen. And tonight I will prove that truth stands taller than your lies." The crowd hushed. The jeers thinned out. The night air was thick with tension. Hale sneered, stepping closer, his eyes like fire. "Then let her stand on her own, Harnorm," he spat, and he reached for the shawl again. She gasped, clutching it tighter, her knees weak. But the rancher moved like lightning, his body a wall in front of her, his voice thunderous. "She has stood long enough. Tonight she stands behind me." The square held its breath. The lanterns flickered. The crowd was poised between cruelty and awe. And in the silence that followed, the storm of pride and fury threatened to break upon them all. The square erupted the moment Hale lunged, his fists swinging wide, his voice a snarl of pure rage. The crowd surged back, forming a ring, hungry for the spectacle. The rancher met him head-on, their bodies colliding with a thud that rattled the boards beneath the fountain. Hale struck again and again, each blow fueled by his wounded pride. But the rancher absorbed them with the steadiness of stone, his own fists answering in turn. Gasps tore from the onlookers as the fight spilled across the dirt, the lantern light casting long, wild shadows. She stood at the edge of the ring, clutching the shawl, her heart hammering, every single strike echoing in her chest. "Break him!" a voice screamed from the crowd. "Make her pay!" another one shouted. The noise swelled until it shook the windows of the mercantile and sent the church bell quivering in its tower. Hale's men jeered, their laughter as sharp as knives, but others in the crowd watched in silence, awe creeping into their eyes as the rancher refused to falter. Blow after blow rained down, his strength drawn not from anger, but from his vow. At last Hale staggered, blood streaking his lip, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But his pride drove him forward. With a roar, he lunged, not at the rancher, but at her. His hand was outstretched, his fingers aiming to rip the shawl from her shoulders one more time. The crowd gasped, the lantern swaying with the sudden shift. But before Hale's fingers could even brush the fabric, the rancher struck, a single powerful blow that drove Hale hard into the dirt. He sprawled flat, his hat flying off, his pride bleeding into the soil of the square. Silence crashed down, heavy and complete. The rancher stood over him, his chest heaving, his voice thunderous in the hush. "You tear cloth, but you cannot tear truth. You call her unwanted, I call her mine." His words rang against the clapboard walls, echoing down every alley until the square itself seemed to hold its breath. Slowly he turned, his hand reaching for hers. Trembling, she stepped forward, placing her fingers in his, the shawl still clutched to her chest. He took it gently from her, lifting it high before the crowd, its tatters glowing like fire in the lantern light. "This shawl is torn," he said, his voice steady. "But it still warms, it still belongs, just as she does." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, uncertain, divided. Some people scoffed, unwilling to yield their scorn, but others shifted their feet, shame flickering in their eyes, as if the truth in his words had finally cut through the smoke of their cruelty. Children stared, wide-eyed, their small hands clutching at their mother's skirts. A woman near the front wiped at her eyes, though she said nothing. Hale groaned in the dirt, his fury smoldering but broken, his men too cowed to step forward and help him. The rancher lowered the shawl, draping it back across her shoulders with a tenderness that stilled her trembling. She lifted her chin, meeting the eyes of the crowd, no longer cowering beneath their jeers. For the first time, she stood not in the shadow of shame, but in the light of defiance and a vow. The silence deepened, broken only by the hiss of the lanterns and the ragged breath of a man whose pride had been torn to rags. But in that silence, she knew it wasn't the end. Hale's hatred was still smoldering, and before the night was over, he would rise again. And this time, it wouldn't be her shawl he would try to shred. It would be the very bond that had just been forged between them, before all of Dustin. The crowd held its breath as Hale dragged himself up from the dirt. His face was twisted with rage, his pride bleeding heavier than the cut on his lip. The lanterns flickered, the square glowing like a stage, every single eye fixed on the man who refused to yield. His voice cracked, raw with fury. "This ain't finished. I'll tear that rag from her yet and show all of Dustin she's nothing." He lunged once more, wild and reckless, but the rancher met him with a single, crushing blow. The sound cracked through the square like a rifle shot. Hale collapsed in the dust, unmoving, save for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. Silence followed, thick and absolute, broken only by the soft hiss of the lantern flames. The rancher stood over him, his chest rising steady, his shadow long across the ground. Then he turned, his gaze falling on her, where she stood trembling at the edge of the ring, the shawl clutched to her chest. Slowly, deliberately, he crossed to her, every eye in Dustin following his every move. He took the torn fabric from her hands, holding it high so that all of them could see the tatters glowing gold in the lamplight. "This shawl has been mocked," he said, his voice carrying across the silent square. "Torn and trampled, but it has endured, just as she has endured." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And before all of you, I say this. What's torn can still be whole. What's scorned can still be chosen." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. The weight of his words was breaking through their sneers. Some of the men dropped their eyes, shame darkening their faces. A few women dabbed at tears, their mouths trembling with words they didn't speak. For the first time, the square didn't laugh. It listened. He lowered the shawl, placing it gently across her shoulders. His hands were steady, reverent, as if he were crowning her in front of them all. Her breath caught in her throat, her tears spilling, not with shame, but with a dignity she had thought was lost forever. The crowd hushed, their jeers smothered by the sight of her standing so tall, her chin lifted, her shawl gleaming like a banner. The rancher's voice softened, but it carried still. "You called her unwanted. I call her mine, and if any man doubts it, let him stand where Hale has fallen." No one moved. Hale groaned in the dirt, his pride shattered beyond repair. His men shifted uneasily, unwilling to lift him. The silence deepened, and in it, a truth settled over the square that was heavier than stone. The jeers had lost their power. She raised her hand, trembling, and touched the shawl where it lay upon her shoulders, feeling the weight not of shame, but of choice, of a vow, of something sacred. For the first time, she did not shrink beneath their eyes. She met them, steady and unbroken. The rancher turned, his hand finding hers, his grip firm. His gaze locked with hers for a moment that seemed to still the night. Together they walked from the square. The crowd parted in silence, the lanterns flickering as if they were bowing to their passage. Behind them, Hale lay crumpled in the dirt, his reign of scorn undone. Ahead of them, the night stretched wide, the stars sharp and clear above the dark plains. She pressed the shawl closer, its threads frayed but strong, its warmth carrying both her mother's memory and the vow of the man who had just given it back to her. For the first time in Dustin, She did not feel like the unwanted one. She felt chosen. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Echoes of the West. If your dignity was torn in front of a crowd, would you cling to the shreds or wear them proudly as your crown?